Hello, and welcome to another episode of Undiscovered Beasts and Strange Phenomena. Please join our experienced and knowledgeable panel of hosts as we explore the great mysteries of our time: Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, and unexplained phenomena.
Greetings. Welcome to From Beyond, Not of This Earth. I'm your host, William Pullin. Tonight we're going to discuss one of the most important cases in ufology. A multiple witness case with physical evidence. A multiple witness case with multiple investigators examining what transpired. I speak of the April 24th, 1964 Socorro, New Mexico landing case, sometimes better known as the Lonnie Zamora case. We're going to discuss some of the details of the case at length, some of the investigators and when they arrived on the scene, which is somewhat important, and what did not transpire in the efforts to investigate this case. This began April 24th of 1964, a Friday, close to approximately 5:50 p.m. local time in Socorro, New Mexico. Police officer Lonnie Zamora, who was in the midst of chasing a speeding car heading south through town, was in hot pursuit. They're heading toward the local rodeo grounds. Less than a minute into the chase, he heard what he thought was an explosion. He knew he was in the vicinity of a nearby dynamite shack. At some point, he observed a brilliant blue cone of flame off to the south-southwest in the direction of the shack, which made him break off the chase. He went to investigate what transpired, the sound, and hence we begin the anomalous event. At some point, Zamora drove into an arroyo, which is basically a miniaturized valley outside of town, and came across an object he at first described as an upturned vehicle. Those were his initial observations. He stopped his car. He started to get out of his car and walk toward this object. He became aware of two individuals, two small figures outside the object. As he got closer to it, he realized this object was not an upturned vehicle, but was an egg-shaped, rounded craft on landing gears. He noticed a signal, some sort of writing on the side of the craft. What exactly that writing means, no one knows. The actual description of the writing has been argued at length to this day. And that actually is not a very important point in this case, but we'll touch on it later. Zamora at some point gets to within several hundred yards of this craft. The occupants, and I label them occupants, you could call them creatures, aliens, what have you, but I go with UFO occupants, became aware of Zamora and reacted to his presence. They went to the back of the craft, and he heard a loud clank. He assumed it was a door into this object. He immediately heard a roar, and saw a flame emanating from the bottom of the object, and the object began to rise to the sky. Upon seeing that, he immediately turned around and started running back toward his cruiser. He lost what they used to call spectacles, his glasses, in the process, which is not really important because all the observations he made of the craft and the occupants he made prior to losing his glasses. At some point, the object reaches a certain amount of altitude. The roar stops, the flame disappears, and it begins horizontal flight silently out of town. At some point, he loses visual sight of it. And that's kind of the gist of the case. There's a lot more details, but for many, many decades, people thought this was a single witness case until new data came to light recently through the efforts of Ben Moss, Tony Andiola, and my friend Kevin Randall. And they've determined that there were multiple witnesses to this case. Those witnesses were not followed through. There was no effort to find out who they were, which is a horrible piece of investigative work, but again, we'll get back to that later. So in the process of this broadcast, I'm going to discuss and quote Zamora's own words. I think that's important. I could process and give out the information secondhand through my own research. I think it's more important to give the words of the witness. Since Zamora was our first-hand witness and he experienced this event, an event that left him flabbergasted. His friend Sergeant Sam Chavez described him as having seen a ghost, pale, very troubled by what he witnessed. So clearly he saw something that was anomalous, which does not mean alien, but something anomalous that affected him to a great degree. Again, Zamora was a police officer. He's trained to handle intense situations, and this situation affected him on a very personal level. So we'll get back to that a little bit later, but I want to read a quote from his police report that he would follow right after this case. Quote, he's describing some of the events that started low frequency quickly, then rose in frequency, higher tone, and in loudness, from loud to very loud. At the same time as roars saw flame, flame was under the object. Object was starting to go straight up, slowly up, straight up. Flame was bright blue, and at bottom was sort of orange color. From this angle, saw what might be the side of the object, not end as first noted. Difficult to describe flame. Thought from roar it might blow up. Flame might have come from underside of object at middle, possibly a 4-foot area. Very rough guess. No smoke, except dust in the immediate area. Object was smooth, no windows or doors. As roar started, it was still on or near the ground. Noted red lettering of some type, insignia about 2.5 feet by 2 feet wide, guess. Was in middle of object. Object still like aluminum. White. Unquote. Very interesting. The vast majority of UFO sightings report craft flying by with no sound, no discernible sound, or a very low hum. Zamora described a roar, which leads one to think it might be a chemical rocket, something more earthly in origin. But once this object attained a certain altitude, it resumed silent flight, free of flame. Interesting. Again, are there any conclusions that can be drawn from that? Not really, but it should be noted. He observed that the object had, again, the insignia, red lettering, indiscernible. Obviously not of a language that he could discern, so troubling. And then the object was like aluminum, white. He described it as being oval, egg-shaped, almost a pearly white, free of seams, free of rivets, free of bolts, which again is common to a lot of UFO sightings, where the structure of the craft, in those sightings that do describe structured craft, these craft have no seams, no rivets, no bolts. There's no sign that this object was actually put together. It's structured, but not in the way the earthly vehicles are. So that's a little different. So he described the figures as being very small, maybe the size of boys, and that's an exact quote from him, maybe the size of boys. From the distance he was at, he guessed they were normal in shape, but not normal in size. They were small. He described it, the object was oval-shaped in position so that its long axis was horizontal. In other words, it was slightly longer than it was tall, as if you laid an egg on its side. An interesting point of view from where he was. Again, he made his observations when he was on the ground walking toward the object. This did not transpire over the several minutes. It was several seconds. It was a quick sighting. But he made key observations and pretty accurate observations because, again, he was a law enforcement official. The roar that the object made upon ascending from the ground is interesting because Zamora was under the impression that this thing was going to blow up. Zamora was used to hearing dynamite explosions. He had discerned, he had experienced that sound before. So he was familiar with what an explosion sounded like from a chemical explosive. This reminded him of it, and he was afraid this object would blow up, which of course it didn't. But it's interesting that that was the case. Again, that goes against a lot of other UFO sightings where no sound is discernible. So, very interesting. Another quote from his report, and this is kind of long-winded, but these details are very important to get us going in the direction we want to go. Quote, kept running to north with car between me and object. Glanced back a couple of times. Noted object to rise to about level of car, about 20 to 25 feet, I guess. Took, I guess, about 6 seconds when object started to rise and I glanced back. I guess I ran about halfway to where I ducked down, just over the edge of the hill. I guess I'd run about 25 feet when I glanced back and saw the object about level from the car, and it appeared directly over the place where it rose from, unquote. So he immediately turned around to get back into his cruiser to get away from the flame. The object ascended directly over where it was. It did not ascend at an angle or made any kind of course change. It rose up directly from where it was resting, i.e. like a helicopter or a lunar lander. Later investigations showed that this was not a lunar lander or any kind of experiment being run by NASA. So that explanation doesn't hold any water. Again, these observations are very keen, very direct, full of details. We want UFO sighting reports that involve law enforcement officials, trained observers, military pilots, scientists, because they give us this kind of data. It speaks volumes. And it tends to be very accurate because they file this data immediately after the event transpired, which means human memories are not changing. If they had waited days, years, or months after the facts, human memories do change. Therefore, the testimony gets less accurate. But Zamora filed his police report immediately after this event occurred, so that goes a long way. More quotes. Quote again, "I was still running and I jumped just over the hill. I stopped because I did not hear the roar. I was scared of the roar and I planned to continue running down the hill. I turned around toward the object and at the same time put my head toward the ground, covering my face with arms. Being that there was no roar, I looked up and I saw the object going away from me in a southwest direction. When the roar stopped, I heard a sharp tone whine from high tone to low tone. At the end of the roar was this whine, and the whine lasted maybe a second. Then there was complete silence about the object. That's when I lifted up my head and I saw the object going away from me. It did not come any closer to me. It appeared to go in a straight line and at some same height, possibly 10 to 15 feet from the ground, and it cleared the dynamite shack by about 3 feet. The shack is about 8 feet high. Object was traveling very fast. It seemed to rise up and take off immediately across country. I ran back to my car, and as I ran back, I kept an eye on the object. I picked up my glasses. I left the sunglasses on the ground, got into the car, and radioed to Nep Lopez, the radio operator, to look out the window to see if you could see the object. He asked, 'What is it?' And I answered, 'It looks like a balloon.' I don't know if he saw it. If Nep looked out his window, which faces north, he couldn't have seen it. I did not tell him at the moment which window to look out of," unquote. So the Zamora is describing himself running away from the craft, but when the roar ceased, he felt comfortable looking up at the object and witnessed it flying off quickly in one direction. Again, no sound. Again, a quick movement. And again, it was lost to visual sight relatively quickly. But his testimony is crisp, detailed. He attempted, to his credit, to add another witness, Nep Lopez. Nep Lopez was unable to visually key on the object. Like Zamora said, he didn't have a chance to tell him which window to look out of, so that was kind of an issue. So, again, more quotes. Quote, "As I was calling Nep, I could still see the object. The object seemed to lift up slowly and to get small, quote unquote, in the distance very fast. It seemed to just clear Box Canyon or 6 Mile Canyon mountain. It disappeared as it went over the mountains. It had no flame whatsoever as it was traveling over the ground and made no smoke or noise," unquote. That final sentence speaks volumes. I'll repeat. It had no flame whatsoever as it was traveling over the ground and made no smoke or noise, unquote. Very interesting. His observations were keen. We want, as UFO investigators, to gather evidence as quickly as possible. We want highly trained observers. Most UFO sightings are not reported relatively quickly. Months or weeks go by. So details are lost. The Lonnie Zamora case is not like that in any way, shape, or form. Zamora filed his police report relatively quickly. This happened on a Friday, the 24th. By Tuesday, the 28th, all the major players had arrived. Therefore, only a few days after the event had transpired, and Zamora was still being investigated. Zamora was still giving testimony. But it was still fresh, still very fresh. And that goes a long way in this case. The entire incident, from the sighting of the flame to the disappearance of the object, took less than 2 minutes. Not a long time. Although I must say on a personal level, if I saw an unidentified flying object for 2 minutes, that might seem like an eternity. But that's just a personal observation. So Sam Chavez was called to the scene. When Chavez arrived, he was struck by Zamora's expression. He described it as distraught. Chavez described or testified that he stated to Zamora that, quote, "You look like you've seen the devil," unquote. To which Zamora replied, quote, "Maybe I have," unquote. Initially, Zamora thought it was a secret military device. And for many years, he still thought in that direction. He never really advocated the extraterrestrial in this case, nor should he have. He was an objective observer, so he didn't go with the data and simply gather the evidence as any law enforcement official would. And that's the way he conducted himself. So there was physical evidence left at the scene. There were 4 trapezoidal imprints on the ground. Ray Stanford, who arrived on Tuesday the 28th, who was a representative of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, observed them and described them as, quote, "They were apparently made by wedge-shaped units being forced by great weight down into the rather well-packed soil of the ravine. The dimensions of each wedge involved must have been a horizontal length of 12 to 16 inches, a width horizontally of 6 to 8 inches, and a vertical wedge depth of possibly 4 to 6 inches, although the total depth is difficult to determine for the total depressions," unquote. If anybody out there listening has ever been to New Mexico in between the months of April and September, the regolith, the soil, is hard and compacted, dry, hot, not much moisture. So to press in depressions into the ground would take the presence of a heavy object. A heavy craft, perhaps? We don't know. But these depressions of the ground were not dug. They were pressed into the ground, which is an important point, and a very important point. There were 4 of the depressions. And the depressions led a lot of credibility to the case. A lot of UFO cases are all testimony. And while in and of itself, that's important, but testimony alone is not good enough. We need more than that. We need physical evidence. Do we want radiation traces? Yes. Do we want landing traces? Yes. Do we want burn marks? Yes. Do we want changes to vegetation? Yes. We have virtually all of these in this case. We have landing traces. We have burnt vegetation, burn marks, multiple witnesses, which we'll get to later, and multiple investigative groups and individuals looking at this from different angles. It's a case that is full of information, full of different chains of evidence. It's very robust. That goes a long, long way. I'm going to name some of the main players here and their importance in this case. First of which was Ray Stanford. Ray Stanford, I think, is the only individual still alive that was there on the scene in April 1964. He was a member and representative of NICAP. And it's interesting because NICAP, the organization, was not comfortable with UFO occupant cases, and this certainly qualifies as one of those. So it's interesting that they sent representatives to investigate the case, which they weren't really enamored with, but that's kind of the way it was. So Sergeant Sam Chavez was Lonnie Zamora's friend and a fellow officer in Socorro, New Mexico. The FBI agent on the scene was FBI agent Arthur Burns Jr. At some point, he contacted Army Captain Richard T. Holder. He was the commander of the uprange station in White Sands, New Mexico, but he lived in Socorro. Socorro's not that far from White Sands, so he was there on the scene fairly quickly. By Sunday the 26th, Tech Sergeant David Moody, who was a representative from Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's investigative unit, and I use the investigative unit, that term loosely by this time, he was on the scene, as were Jim and Cora Lorenzen, who were the heads of APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization. By Tuesday the 28th, Ray Stanford arrived, as did Jalen Hynek, who was a scientific consultant for Project Blue Book. So all the main players were there by Tuesday. There were other witnesses that were there at the scene in town, but there was trouble with their testimony. Arthur Burns wrote a report on this. He forwarded it to the Pentagon, and the report referred to 3 individuals that called the radio station and referred to the sound of the roar of this object flying overhead, the object that Zamora saw. The time frame matched up. So you have other witnesses. Did that police officer write down their names? No. Did that police officer write down their addresses? No. Did that police officer write down at least their phone numbers, contact information? No. Preposterous. Socorro, New Mexico was quite a bit smaller than it is today. And it really still didn't qualify as a city per se. It's a large town. But back in 1964, it was much smaller. So it would have been much easier logistically to track these people down. That was not done for some strange reason. The Lorenzens didn't do it, which was surprising. Hynek didn't do it, which wasn't surprising. The Air Force officer, David Moody, didn't do it. And neither did Burns or Holder. Although to a point, Burns and Holder weren't UFO investigators. So it really wasn't up their alley to do that kind of work. But nobody followed through and tried to find these other witnesses, which would have not been that hard to do then, which would have left this sighting report, this event, with a lot more importance, which may have precipitated further investigation. As it was viewed as a single witness, which ended up it being cast aside, not really looked at length over the last few decades. But thanks to the work of the aforementioned Ben Moss, Tony Angiola, and Kevin Randall, they found there were multiple witnesses. So now the case is being looked at length again. Is it after the fact, many decades later, because Mr. Zamora passed away? Is it a lost cause? Certainly not. We certainly would have liked to have done that back in the 60s, but it is what it is. So speaking of my friend Kevin Randall, I would strongly encourage anyone out there listening to check out the book, Encounter in the Desert. That entire volume is dedicated to the Socorro, New Mexico landing case. It came out in 2018, I believe, 2019. It's a recent publication. Kevin also discusses this case in the newly released Semester Project Blue Book. That was published in March of this year. Both those books take a good long look at this case, although Encounter in the Desert is a much more specific overall look at the case as opposed to the Semester Project Blue Book, which is more like a summary of the case. So by June 8th, the Air Force issued an official 2-page investigative report on the case. The document, which was riddled with errors, started with a false claim, fake news, misinformation, that Zamora was going north on US 85, US Highway 85, when in fact he was going south on Park Street, west of the highway. Are details like that important? Yes, they are. They mislead the public. We need to be extremely accurate at all times when describing UFO events. So the Air Force is immediately trying to belittle the importance of the case. Was this a concerted effort to do that? Was that a error on purpose? I can't say that. But it speaks volumes about the Air Force. The report that said that the Blue Book investigation, and again I use the word investigation in quotes, had determined the following. 1, no other witnesses to the object reported by Mr. Zamora could be located. That's unreasonable. There was no attempt to find them. They were there. 2, there were no unidentified helicopters or aircraft in the area. That's true. 3, observers at radar installations had observed no unusual or identified blips. That's open for debate. 4, there was no unusual meteorological activity, no thunderstorms. The weather was windy but clear. That is very true. 5, there was no evidence of markings of any sort in the area other than the shallow depressions at the location where Mr. Zamora reported finding the object. Yes, that's true. The only markings were the depressions made by the craft, the landing traces. But there were burn marks. So it wasn't just the landing traces there. So they're kind of hedging the bet. They're trying to lessen the importance of the case. 6, laboratory analysis of soil samples disclosed no foreign material or radiation above normal for the surrounding area. Again, yes and no. That's a gray area. 7, laboratory analysis of the burned bush showed no chemicals that would indicate a type of propellant. That's true. The bush seemed to have been ignited, and this was the bush that was ignited at the landing site. Seemed to be ignited by the heat of the flame, but was not inundated with chemicals. So that's interesting. The other part of this burning bush scenario is that the other side of the bush that was facing away from the craft, was cool to the touch. Only the side that was burning was hot. Anybody who set a bush on fire knows that the entire bush tends to get hot and go up in flames. The scenario or the idea that half the bush would burn while the other half was pristine and cool is unreasonable. 8, there was no evidence presented that the object was extraterrestrial in origin or represented a threat to the security of the United States. That's true. The Air Force, 9, the Air Force is continuing the investigation and the case is still open. That's false. Hector Quintanilla, or Quintanilla, I apologize, I'm butchering the late man's name, was given permission to examine documentation that was above his pay grade, that was above his need to know, above his security clearance. And he was unable to find anything to explain this sighting. So begrudgingly, in a burst of integrity, Quintanilla labeled this unidentified. Outstanding. At the very least, it's unidentified because he couldn't find any other explanation. So the alleged absence of other witnesses, Blue Book spoke with no real authority because there was no effort to find them. The report that Burns sent to the Pentagon specifically referred to 3 witnesses. So nobody followed through. So the idea that the Air Force declared that Blue Book couldn't find witnesses, no, what it should have said was Blue Book made no attempt to find the other witnesses that we knew that were there. It's completely unreasonable what transpired. After all these decades, no evidence of a hoax has ever emerged. No evidence. Again, that speaks volumes. When we look at these UFO sighting reports, landing traces, whatever the case may be, radar visuals, daylight discs, what have you, our first step is to confirm an event took place. Then we attempt to examine the case, find out what transpired. Having said that, no evidence of a hoax has come to light. Therefore, this event is valid. This event may not necessarily be extraterrestrial in origin, but we know this was not a hoax. Therefore, something happened. An event happened. No one is lying about this event. The testimony is held up. The evidence we have, the physical evidence, has held up under scrutiny. The witnesses have held up under scrutiny. So again, it is what it is. It's not like other cases where we've found witnesses that have red flags in their background or some testimony hasn't held up, and there is not one iota of evidence, to show that this case is anything other than a valid multiple witness landing case. That is a very strong statement, but it's backed up by the data. Zamora, at some point, a few years after this event, stopped talking about the sighting case. He was never really belittled by this event. It didn't affect his job, although he did end up leaving the police department and he got another job in the city. So that's interesting. Being that he was viewed as a single witness to this event, he was never belittled. He experienced no ridicule. He just stopped talking about it. He was a pillar of the community, an outstanding citizen, and again a trained observer. By all accounts, he wasn't the sharpest tack in the box, but a very intelligent, cordial gentleman, a man of faith, who had no reason or inclination to hoax or lie about this case. Interesting. Very interesting. There are other cases in New Mexico that were reported around the same time as this event. And we could go into details about them. But being that we're specifically talking about Socorro, we'll stick with this case. And also because of the fact that this is the case with the multiple chains of evidence. The other cases are testimony-driven. But this case has multiple layers. And that goes a long, long, long way. Heineck was skeptical at first about Zamora's truthfulness. But it was a healthy skepticism. Heineck did not go into this case thinking that Zamora had lied. He was just being cautious. After interviewing Zamora, he changed his mind. He felt Zamora was telling the truth. He felt Zamora was being absolutely truthful and stood his ground about this case until the day he died, both Zamora and Hynek. Quintanilla offered this kind of endorsement in the case, even though he didn't label it extraterrestrial, he labeled it unidentified. These words, I think, speak volumes about what he thought of Zamora. Quote, this is from Blue Book Chief Hector Quintanilla. There is no doubt that Elijah Zamora saw an object which left quite an impression on him. There is no question about Zamora's reliability. He is a serious police officer, a pillar of his church, and a man well-versed in recognizing airborne vehicles in his area. He is puzzled by what he saw, and frankly, so are we. This is the best documented case on record, and still we've been unable, in spite of thorough investigation, to find this vehicle or other stimulus that scared Zamora to the point of panic, unquote. That is an outstanding quote coming from Hector Quintanilla. By this point, and this is post-Edward Ruppelt era at Blue Book was a PR organization. They didn't investigate cases very thoroughly at all. The best cases didn't go to Blue Book anyway. But their efforts were in the direction of debunking UFO cases, labeling them with any kind of explanation, even if the explanation didn't fit the data. So for him to come out and say that speaks volumes. He was ordered to belittle the UFO topic. He was ordered to find an explanation, put something on there, label it. Don't label it unexplained. Yet Quintanilla had no choice but to do that. Outstanding. I will read this quote again because it's so important to hear those words coming from an individual like Quintanilla. Again, quote, there is no doubt that Elijah Zamora saw an object which left quite an impression on him. There is no question about Zamora's reliability. He is a serious police officer, a pillar of his church, and a man well-versed in recognizing airborne vehicles in this area. He is puzzled by what he saw, and frankly, so are we. This is the best documented case on record, and still we've been unable, in spite of thorough investigation, to find the vehicle or other stimulus that scared Zamora to the point of panic. Unquote. That's incredible. Outstanding. Quintanilla was not endorsing the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Not at all. He was just unable to find an answer. In later years, he felt that the answer might have been in Zamora's head, meaning that Zamora was holding something back. He wasn't quite comfortable talking about the case completely honestly. Not that he lied, but that he was his testimony was not complete. There were other parts of the case that were in his head that he hadn't vocalized about. I don't believe that one iota. I don't believe that one bit. The other aspect of that quote is the idea that Quintanilla at some point did label this case unidentified. He was very worried about that. He felt the UFO buffs in the hobby clubs, meaning NICAP and APRO, and other smaller groups that were operating at the time in the mid-'60s, would have a field day. They would embrace this as a real UFO. They would embrace this as real alien. And that's not what Blue Book wanted. Blue Book wanted these cases to go away. They wanted the public to forget about the UFO topic so that clubs would have a hard time existing because membership would drop. You want to take your eye off the ball. You want the public to not think about the UFO topic. But when you label a case unidentified, that's a flag for all the world to see. And the public did become aware of this case. On Saturday, April 25th, the Zamora landing case was talked about by Walter Cronkite on the CBS ED News. So this was national news at the time. It's interesting that was transpired. This, again, like Roswell for the 24 hours it was known, like some other cases around through the history of the UFO topic, i.e. Phoenix Lights, things of that nature. Some of these cases have made national news and been covered in a legitimate way. The Zamora case was, as was the 1966 Dexter, Michigan sightings, the swamp gas fiasco, which Hynek suffered through. Those were covered by the national news in a legitimate way. But as was the Socorro case. The great debunker, and I hate to use the word great, but he was, Philip J. Klass speculated, and he was drawing on innuendo rather than actual evidence. He felt that Zamora had conspired with the mayor of the town, Holm, I'm going to draw a blank here, Burzum Jr., who owned the property in which the UFO landing reportedly occurred. It turns out he didn't. He didn't own the property. And then they were going to manufacture a UFO incident to attract tourists to the town. This is prior to Roswell becoming known to the public. So there was already an idea of if a UFO event happens, we can have a festival here, draw crowds, draw tourists to the place, bring in money for the economy, because again, Socorro was a small place. That was not true. That never happened. There's no UFO museum there. There's no UFO festival. The town has not embraced green aliens at the local McDonald's. It hasn't. So Klass's idea didn't hold any water. It's interesting that Klass in an earlier commentary, I'll be kind, an earlier commentary on this case speculated that Zamora was actually witnessing an extraordinary plasma phenomenon associated with high voltage transmission lines, which is kind of the idea that they were pushing forth for during the not just the Dexter, Michigan case, the Exeter, New Hampshire multiple witness case back in '65. Same thing. They're trying to describe an anomalous event with another anomalous event that's unexplained. The Air Force on several occasions attempted to explain UFO sightings with ball lightning. In other words, they were trying to explain an unexplained with another unexplained. Illogical, to say the least. Having said that, Klass had a penchant for thrown out explanations that didn't fit the data at all. And even a non-UFO researcher could look at this and say, wow, Klass's explanation doesn't hold any water. But Klass was comfortable with doing that, being the great debunker that he was. But his ideas did not hold any water. So there you have it. Now, Ben Moss and Tony Angiola found, in a roundabout way, and as they care of Randall, they got into contact with Carmen Morano. Carmen Morano was the last head of Project Blue Book. He was in charge of dismantling the structure of the Blue Book offices, which were located in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And Carmen Morano saved a lot of the original files from Project Blue Book. And Moss and Angiola and Randall and Kevin already has a complete set of the Blue Book files, but they found the extra information contained within the files, which strengthened the case and brought forth the idea that this is multiple witness. No, we don't have the names of the witnesses. No, we don't know who they are, but we know they existed. Arthur Burns, his report was not a hoax. He would not have lied in a report that he sent to the Pentagon. He would not have done that. Therefore, we know 3 other witnesses are in existence. How many more are out there? We don't know, because there was no effort by Hynek, Burns, Holder, Stanford, or the Lorenzens to look into this to find other witnesses. We just don't know. In a town as small as Socorro, a low-flying object exhibiting a loud roar as it's flying by or ascending into the air would have been heard by many. This is not a town that was overflown by many aircraft at all. So a loud roar emanating from something in the air would have been noticed. So we could safely assume there are other witnesses there. Are they still alive with us? Probably not. But this is entered the realm of a multiple witness case, not single witness. It's a strong case. It's a multiple witness case with multiple chains of evidence, and it was investigated by not just PR firms. I hate to be that blunt, but Blue Book was a PR firm. It was not just investigated by them, but by the Lorenzens, by Ray Stanford, by the FBI, and by the Army. So legitimate and non-legitimate investigative groups and individuals looked at this case. It remains unexplained. My professional position is that it's one of the few cases that describes alien visitation. Can I prove that? Absolutely not. I think the data strongly suggests that, points in that direction. Will we ever be able to prove it? Most likely not. But it's a fascinating case, and it should be reviewed. Unlike other cases like Roswell, Rendlesham Forest, Cash Landrum in Houston back in 1980, those cases are well known. The Socorro landing case, not so much. And it should be examined. So I would encourage everyone out there to take another look. Take a second look and find out what's going on. Find out the new developments in the efforts to find out what happened. Take a look at Encounter in the Desert by Kevin Randall. Outstanding book. Meticulously written. Typical Kevin. So, and go forward from there and discover the case that made news in April 1964. So, outstanding. I want to thank everybody for listening live and otherwise. I'm getting more and more comfortable with these kind of broadcasts. I admittedly am not used to having a broadcast where I'm not interacting with listeners, fielding comments and questions. So I have struggled a bit, but I'm pushing forward to better and better each time. So I appreciate all your support and all your interest. So you guys can find me at U for Real, a historical review, my UFO interactive group on Facebook, or my personal blog page entitled William Pullin, UFO Historian. You're more than welcome to join, support the interaction and the conversation, join the conversation. Put in your 2 cents, and you can contact me. We can talk about UFOs and go from there. So from beyond, not of this earth, this is William Pullin signing off. Until next time, take care.